Hey, hi, Shel. Thank you for coming. It's just nice to see you again. You're actually one of my only internet friends. In fact, the only internet friend whom I met via the internet during COVID, I believe it was, and that I actually met in person when
In
somebody
person.
came and visited Japan. So I thought that
In
was awesome. So
2023. Yeah,
yeah, thank you
yeah.
for doing that. It was just kind of a treat to meet people you've only known digitally before in person. Please introduce yourself, tell us what you do, and the provocative part of my first question is tell us why we should listen to you.
Okay, well, you know that people are always telling you you can either have a profitable business or one that does good in the world. So my mission is to tell you that that's actually a both and, that you can have a profitable business that does good in the world. And in fact, in many ways, it's easier. So my name is Shel Horowitz, and I put up a website in, I think, 2015 called goingbeyondsustainability.com. I have written 10 nonfiction books, and four of them are about this intersection of profitability and environmental and social good. This is the most recent one, Guerrilla Marketing to Heal the World, part of the famous Guerrilla Marketing series started by my co-author, J. Conrad Levinson, in 1984. Now, I wrote
Very
about
cool.
60,000 words of that book, 65,000 words. Jay wrote 300, and then I borrowed another 300 from something he wrote that only had his byline on it. So it was not an equal co-partnership, but I was very glad to be a part of that enterprise. And it definitely opens doors when you're associated with an internationally famous brand in marketing. So I came to this work by a rather unusual route, I would say. I have had a marketing practice as a business owner since the early 80s, but as a skill set acquirer since the early 70s. But the other half of my background is in political activism. And what happened in my own neighborhood, actually, the mountain right behind my house, which I will show you, is a state park called Skinner State Park, Mount Holyoke, in Hadley and South Hadley, Massachusetts. And the mountain next to that, a developer decided he was going to put 40 McMansions going all the way from the baseline to the top, ruining the view from the mountain that's the state park and ruining the neighborhood in a lot of different ways. And I was the one who said, no, you're not. So I started a movement called Save the Mountain. And I thought we would win from the get-go, but I also thought it would take 5 years. And we did it in 13 months flat, so just over a year.
Wow.
And after the dust settled, I realized that this campaign in the activist side of my life had taken everything I knew about marketing and also taught me new skills that I hadn't had before, like lobbying. And I thought, well, gee, if there's that much crossover going that direction, what can I bring from the activist world to the business community? And
Hmm.
that was very early 2000s when things like Enron and Martha Stewart and WorldCom were erupting across the business pages as scandals, people doing the wrong thing. So I came up with the idea that business ethics and social responsibility and environmental responsibility could actually be good for business. And I started exploring that, and I discovered that all the research bore it out. That everybody said, oh, socially conscious businesses are actually much better poised to be profitable. They have a lot less impediment to succeeding. So that's now I'm like almost 25 years into this side of the journey, and it's been a wild and fascinating ride.
Excellent. Thank you. I really love as you were speaking, I absolutely had to look up the book. I have either the digital or the hard copy of Guerrilla Marketing. I tried to convince my
Oh, the original
boss
Guerrilla
years
Marketing?
ago. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. To
Yeah,
read
he
it, and he didn't want to. It was like, yeah, well, this is only a hobby business. It's like, yeah, but your hobby business is failing, and maybe putting in a little bit of effort and less money, or he had zero marketing going on. So it's like,
Yeah.
at least try this. At least it's the minimalist marketing in terms of budget, but you're doing nothing. And, during the bubble here, you know, any idiot could just put English on a sign or English school on a sign, and I'm not joking, and would get traffic. But you can't stay with that when years and decades later, that's not the case. And I actually witnessed in the case of this one business, it was like they moved from one office with whatever amount of square feet it had into another office, which was very obviously smaller in the same building, because they
Mhm.
were clearly either losing students, they were aging out because most of the students were seniors anyway. But it was like, if you don't even want to save your own business, I can't help. I'm only here to teach the classes,
Right.
to teach the
Well,
English
yeah.
classes.
Jay wrote the first guerrilla marketing book and then put his name on another hundred or so.
Wow.
So I did the two on green and social change businesses. And again, typically the co-author does most of the heavy lifting. But it was still, it was a great honor to be part of that organization. And I've spoken at their conferences, and I have a good relationship with his widow. And
Mhm.
she gave me a wonderful testimonial after I spoke at her conference. And, but the whole idea that Jay came up with, and his students, by the way, before he launched the Guerrilla Marketing brand, like anybody in Silicon Valley in the '80s studied with him.
Mhm.
Steve Jobs, Bill Gates. I just, so he has something of a track record. And the idea is that
I'd
you're quick
say.
and you get in maybe before your large, clumsy opponent even notices there's a market, and maybe you're even out of that market by the time they notice it. So you
Mhm.
can't get crushed by them. And it's kind of unfortunate that he chose the military metaphor that he did, but it's been a good branding tool for him
Mhm.
and all of us who have worked with him.
Mhm.
And, my background, I came to marketing largely through the PR side, but expanded into many other areas. One that I love to talk about is partnering with people who are already in your market. And in
Mhm.
fact, I have an idea for my 11th book that I'm going to be pitching to organizations that one of them has a reach in like the several tens of millions members, and the other,
Mhm.
I think, has several tens of thousands, to
Mhm.
basically see if they want to make this book a joint project because it's targeted to people 60 and up,
Mhm.
and but it will be on how to be an activist at 80
Nice.
up. Yeah, and I'm now
Right.
68 and I've been an activist since I was 12, so I have been doing this for 46 years. No, 56 years. Math was never my best subject.
I get it. I love that though. It's sort of like you've been doing it. It's sort of like me in fitness, right? If somebody says, "Well, Tim, how long have you been doing fitness?" It's like, well, 16 or 17. I'm 58 now. So, 41 years, kind of probably know something that works and know something that works sustainably. And it's ironic because it's a sort of double entendre there, right? Sustainability of the practice, but also sustainability in terms of the environment in the case of your particular
Absolutely.
thing.
And you need both. If you have a business that's ecologically sustainable but economically unsustainable, you don't have a business, you have a charity.
Right, right.
And
That's a
you're
good
the
point.
you're the donor to the charity. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, you have to make it work. And I have made my own living doing a number of different aspects. Until recently, the bulk of it was coming from book shepherding books that make the world better in some way. I'm going to
Mhm.
finish the one I have on my desk now, and I just finished the other one. It's out since the fall, and then I think I'm not going to be doing that anymore because I don't feel like I've kept up enough. But I'll still probably be doing a lot of individual hour by hour consulting with authors who want to understand what their publishing options are, and perhaps writing their press releases and their jacket copy, which are stuff I'm really good at, because I'm
Mhm.
ultimately the part of marketing that I am is I'm a copywriter.
Right. So I have a question just because I want to make sure that everybody else, like guerrilla marketing, even though it has that sort of warlike aspect, it's very clear when you hear it. It's an effective piece of wordcraft because everybody knows what, guerrilla warfare is. So guerrilla marketing is beautiful in that you instantly understand what they're talking about from two words. I think it's also true for book shepherding, but to make sure that I understand what I think you mean by book shepherding, can you tell us what book shepherding entails?
Sure. It's depending on how intensely people want to engage with me on it. It could be anything from giving advice as needed every few months on a half an hour or an hour consult call up to full project management. And the two that I've just one completed and one hopefully will go to press this year Both of those were full project management, and they're exhausting to do. There's so many
Mhm.
details. It's the learning curve on self-publishing is really pretty steep, and having walked that path for five of my own 10 books and
Mhm.
helped another dozen or so authors walk it over the last 20, 25 years. Yeah, but again, I don't want to do a full soup to nuts A to Z project management of a book again. I'm tired of that. But I do feel like in terms of marketing approaches for a book, who you might partner with, what kind of copy you might write. Let me just talk
Mhm.
about copy for a minute, because when I say press release, a lot of people's eyes glaze over because they would think that to do a press release, you need to be as dull as possible. So someone came to me quite a while ago with a book on electronic privacy and asked me to write a press release. And the typical how to write press releases material would tell you to come up with something like electronic privacy expert releases new book. Shh.
Mhm.
My headline was, and I know you grew up in Canada. I imagine you saw the it's 10 o'clock public service announcements growing up, even though they were from our side of the border. But anyway, there was this campaign, it's 10 o'clock. Do you know where your children are? That was got
Mhm.
a lot of traction as kind of a meme before there were such a things as internet memes. So my headline for that book was, It's 10 o'clock. Do you know where your credit history is? What if you discovered it was vacationing, quote unquote, in databanks of huge corporations that do not have your interest at heart? And it went on from there. And if I were doing it today, I would probably focus on identity theft rather than electronic privacy. But that
Mm.
was the hot button issue at the time. And that was a press release that was guaranteed not to put anybody to sleep.
The point really comes across because when you said it, I immediately went to identity theft, not digital privacy, because to me, I think of them as synonymous because, as you said, that's sort of more relevant to our time. So
Yeah.
let's steer this a little bit because this is all relevant. And what's particularly relevant, especially when we previously talked, was obviously this is transforming organizational culture. And you've authored on the making social impact organizations. And as we talked about there, it was like the intersection between these is how can leaders do that? And one of my passion themes or projects that has come out of all that I've done in recent years with my consulting is about organizational culture in general, and that they overlap pretty well because in Daniel Pink's books, one of my favorite from him was Drive, and it talked about mastery, autonomy, and purpose. And I think where we get the biggest intersection between organizational culture and what you do is that the purpose of the environment is now, ironically, I've said this for years. The hippies were right in terms of right. It was just a bunch of crazy pot smokers saying, the environment, this is bad. We should be doing something about this. And now, you're a fringe wearing a tinfoil hat if you say global warming isn't true. That kind of thing. Whereas the fringe before was saying we need to be concerned about this. Now, like 99% or whatever the current figure is of all authoritative scientists in the world are saying it's not a fringe. We're already, sort of the 11th hour and 55 minutes, I think, in some cases, from something that goes beyond the sustainability tipping point for the environment.
Yeah, and we see this in the Earth fighting back. It's me when I see all of these climate-related storms and weather craziness and fires in Los Angeles and flooding in this place and drought in this other place. It's like the Earth has said, humans, you haven't gotten it together. We've given you the last 50 years that you knew about it, and you still haven't gotten your stuff together. Well, we can teach you some lessons here. The Earth will be fine, and the cockroaches will be fine, but humans may not
Right.
survive the planet if we don't start acting like we deserve it. I'm not
Agreed.
saying it's like behavioral cause and effect, but just the Earth systems are so stressed that the Earth is putting in protective mechanisms to defend itself against humans, just like ant colonies put in protective measures to prevent attacks by the animals that predate on them.
And you're right. Recently, I still do some ESL, some English as a second language, because I have to maintain my visa here in Japan. And one of my students, I was telling them about George Carlin. I love George Carlin for a lot of reasons, but one of my favorite reasons is, and I learned this probably after his death, but I saw an interview and he says, I'm not a comedian. I'm a writer who does comedy. because he
Mhm.
is, he was like intellectual and a great wordsmith and that. And he said it, and I just shared it with my English student, some George Carlin, politically incorrect, the kind of stuff that he did. And I didn't even realize it had been so long since I'd last seen it. It was like, the earth is going to shake us off like fleas. The earth will be fine. It's more a question of whether we're here to see it being fine
Yep.
again.
Yep.
That
I wrote a poem a few years ago. The headline, I don't think I'd seen that particular Carlin routine. The title of the poem was Gaia Will Be Fine, and Gaia, of course, is a hippie word for the
mm,
earth. The messaging has to do a lot also, because like so much of the climate messaging is all doomy, gloomy stuff. Like, oh,
hmm
the sky is falling, Chicken Little. It didn't work for Chicken Little. It doesn't work for us. And
hmm
that's why I've chosen to focus my messaging on, hey, here's how you can actually make money keeping the earth from destroying us. Um, and as a speaker and lecturer and consultant, I try to bring that message into as many different channels as I can.
And that's where we bridge over, as I said, regarding this is since what matters and builds cultures and makes people want to stay, to be proud of where they were. I mean, I used to work at a printing plant. What did we print? Your Safeway flyer. So literally it was like, what do you do for a living, Tim? It was like, I print junk mail. It didn't matter to me at all that I made good money and had good benefits. I hated almost every day I was there because I felt like, we could be printing books on something that mattered. But no, we print junk mail. This does not
Oh,
contribute to the world in a way I would like. So it's a perfect example of no matter what you're doing at work, no matter how good you're getting paid, it doesn't feel and you're not motivated in the same way as if, you know what? We educate people. We help people really take care of their health. We're not selling them crappy supplements. We're teaching them how to live a healthy lifestyle. We're helping them educate about how to operate as a business doing social good on the earth. So when that intersects with or becomes part of the organizational culture, people feel like my job matters. And when people feel like their job matters beyond that paycheck, it gives the additional purpose, then it really comes together in terms of things like employee retention,
yeah,
loyalty.
yeah. I mean, just imagine if that printing plant you work for had told you, look, I know this seems like meaningless work, but we are helping people be better financial stewards of their paycheck by
hmm
showing them how they can save money on their groceries. They're putting in the exact same flyer. Or maybe they do a Costco and they put some informational content in there saying, like, here's how you tell a good head of lettuce from a bad one or whatever. But there's a way of thinking about the message. I'm reminded of the old story, and I have no idea who came up with this originally, or maybe it actually happened. I doubt it, about the man who was interviewing three bricklayers in France. What are you doing? The first one says, I'm laying bricks. The second one says, I'm building a wall. And the third one says, I'm laying the foundation for a cathedral for the glory of God.
hmm
They're all doing exactly the same thing, but they perceive it
Yeah.
totally different.
And mindset has become, the word that they used to use, and I still default to quite often, is just frame, as in,
Yeah,
of course,
yeah.
short for frame of reference, but mindset, it's true. And though, the flyers did help them save money, they did use that a little bit, but they could have made it better and there's a lot of things they could have done to make it more meaningful, but
Mhm.
still mostly it was a hard sell versus, like I said, we're printing books or we have another format or bring in the flyer to the store and you will get a discount and it will
Mhm.
be fully recycled. Now, if they said something like that, now if they did something like that, it would have changed my frame of reference, my purpose to say, okay, they're printing, they're using trees, but all of that is going back into the system. They're upcycling. In fact, at the same time when I was working there, one of the byproducts of the printing presses themselves is this incredibly fine paper powder. And I know what they did with it. They threw it away. So in their sort of organizational, in-plant newsletter, I says, why aren't we using this for polish? That is because I'm for many years now have sort of been a jewelry enthusiast or a jewelry making enthusiast. When you looked at the bars, that is, when the paper runs over the different bars that change the direction of the paper, the web of paper as it passes through the machine, those bars had a mirror polish. That means if you got a tumbler or any other system where you want a vibrational tumbler, when you put jewelry in to get polished in a tumbler, it's either rotational as the
Mhm.
traditional one or it's vibrational. But then you put in some abrasive and some liquid and you just leave it and it polishes it to a mirror finish. It would be just one more example. They could have actually profited off of selling that and using it as this third product, but none of that kind of stuff was happening. Needless to say, no matter how much they paid me, it was like, it's a job, but it's not really what I'd like to be doing. So it's a perfect
Well, the
example.
nice thing is that there are so many companies now that are figuring this out, that are
Hmm.
turning their waste products into other products. And, who are thinking systemically, who are looking at what they call the circular economy, where nothing is wasted. Nature is a circular economy. Nature
Right.
does not create waste. Everything has a use. Poop has a use, makes great fertilizer. It's just amazing. There are some really innovative things. There's a guy named Gunter Pauli who's written a few books on this, and there are other people who've written some amazing books on this. And just what can be done if you think differently is phenomenal. And you end up with multiple profit centers. And the nice thing about that is then if your core product suddenly becomes obsolete in the marketplace, you can still sell the residual stuff that you were using to make it before and figure out something to make instead that'll generate the same stuff.
Right. And one of the businesses that comes up because I've read Firms of Endearment, which we talked about before, and I can't remember the author's name, but it's awesome. And then the one that was by the owner of Whole Foods before it was sold to Amazon.
John Mackey, Conscious Capitalism, I think it was called.
Yes, thank you. And I actually knew one of the people who I had met through some networking thing during COVID, one of the mastermind groups of business networking things I was in, somebody who worked pre-Amazon. She was actually given a severance package by Amazon, who actually worked, and she was the sort of head of the recycling, the composting, where they were at least doing a really good job about taking any waste that was organic and turning it into something useful.
Mhm.
So it was another example of, people are a lot more proud of where they work if they have something like this. So let me get on to something else, which is just a previous question. I love going down rabbit holes, but I want to ask you for some alternative formats and which one you prefer. So here are the choices: a spontaneous conversation like we've had thus far, some fixed questions, random questions, both, or some format I have not yet thought of.
I'm okay with any of them. I tend to really like the spontaneous conversations because it does allow us to get down the rabbit holes, and you, like me, are wired to explore them. It frustrates some people who are linear thinkers, but those of us who are
Mhm.
not linear thinkers, we love not knowing what hole we're going to fall into and where it's going to lead. You have specific questions you want to make sure to get in, then sure, ask them away, and we'll probably get led down rabbit holes by those as well.
I think you're absolutely right there.
While you're doing that, I mention another book that people like us, the more ADD side of your career, it's called The Renaissance Soul. The author is Margaret Lobenstein, Lobenstine. She was actually a friend of mine. And her
Hmm.
thesis is that people can be broken down into either the kind of person like Mozart, who knows in diapers what they're going to do and just pursues it their entire life, or the Ben Franklin type, who everything is too interesting to do that. They
Hmm.
cannot focus on one thing their entire career. They might stay in one aspect for 10 or 50 years. That was 10 or 50, 50, but they were still
Hmm.
there. They're going to be exploring all the time where that can lead, what can happen. And I'm
Hmm.
definitely a Franklin type. I think so are you.
Mm. And I think I'm a hybrid in that way because honestly, had you talked to me probably at 8 years old, said, "What do you want to be?" I would say an inventor. Now, that word is dangerous in terms of corporate America, corporate anywhere, which is a little bit of a shame because even the USPTO calls them the inventor on those documents. But in the jargon, in the corporate ease jargon, it's better to say product developer. But it's interesting because you're right. I have interests of many varieties, but to me, almost everything is not everything, but almost everything is an exploration of or a creation of an invention. The
Mhm.
consulting to me is exactly that. It was like, here's a problem that's very identified within the business world, which is most people hate their jobs. They don't want to be there. There's no psychological safety in their jobs. Therefore, instead of tapping into the group genius of the entire body and brain and experience of everybody in the organization. It's the egotist or the narcissist at the top who sets policy, and he, like everybody else, she, like everybody else, don't know what they don't know. And, it's come out more in the last decade or two, definitely, that people are saying that, to use the words, to use the stereotypical version, that Steve Jobs type leader, even though there is people like Elon Musk, they are the exception to the rule, and they're kind of a negative exception to the rule in that empathetic leaders who want to be corrected, disagreed with, and tap into the collective genius of their companies overwhelmingly do better as organizations, and overwhelmingly do better, certainly in terms of culture, because Steve Jobs was documented. And I know this because I've read the books about it, or listened to the books about it. And I was like, he would look at people and he would say, "You are a waste of space." Exactly what kind of culture do you create when your boss tells you you're a waste of space?
Yeah, and Musk is another one who has no personal skills at all. And not interestingly enough, neither of them have really that much of an engineering background, as far as I know. They both knew how to be in the right place at the right time. And Musk, in particular, acquired pretty much everything he's ever done. He didn't start any of it. I think some of the issues that particularly Twitter has had since he took it over have a lot to
Mhm.
do with him not understanding what you just said. But it's
Right.
interesting because you made that differentiation, which you saw as being two different words for the same thing, inventor and product developer. I'm
Hmm.
going to say that I see those totally differently. A product developer is working in a corporation, has instructions
Mm.
from a product developer is the person that Steve Jobs would have hired to create
Hmm.
the stuff that he did. An inventor is somebody who might go to Steve Jobs and say, "Hey, look what I did. Do you want to buy it?" From outside
Hmm.
the company. An inventor is going to be much more free-spirited, much more creative, and much more willing to go down those rabbit holes. A Buckminster Fuller type.
Right. And I
And
agree.
yeah,
The nuance of the word, and it's just the reason, and this is actually an example of sort of the reductiveness of traditional corporate awareness or corporate frames of reference, whatever you want to call it. That's why they like inventors to call themselves product developers. In fact, I did training years ago under a fairly famous guy. His big thing was how to license products.
mhm.
And he was the one who said, "Look, it might be meaningful and you might like to call yourself an inventor. Keep that in private because it, unfortunately, rightly or wrongly, gives just a different impression for the reasons you're talking about." And at least for the most part, it is still not a very positive thing to say, because it's like, you don't sound corporate enough for them. I'm an inventor. I just use that word so they can understand.
The people who are out of the box thinkers are not going to be corporate. And that's just a struggle I've
Right.
had in my own business because the corporations aren't particularly interested because I don't fit that mold. I have long hair and I have not worked for a corporation since 1978, and it's a very different way of being in the world. But, the myth of the solo flying inventor who does it all him or herself and never has to look, that's also a myth
Oh,
because
for
most
sure.
successful inventions are part of the group mind. It's not one guy working in a lab somewhere or one woman working in a lab somewhere. It's somebody with a
Mhm.
team and somebody with connections in the industry, somebody who's observing trends, somebody who's watching two or three iterations ahead of where we are to see where it's going to be and is waiting and ready when that shows up.
Yeah, that's a good point. A couple of books, I can't remember the name. He's a psychologist too, but the reason I love Group Genius is because it's like the alliteration of it. And there's a book called Group Genius by, I think his last name is Sawyer or something, but he talks about that, and he argues very well and well supported about it is more like what Newton said. If I've seen so far, I've stood on the shoulders of giants. And even Adam Grant, in one of his books, I think it was called Think Again, he talked about how, everybody is like, as the example, it's like, "Oh, Steve had all this innovation." Well, yes, when you read Isaacson's biography of his, that's true to some degree because he was so insistent, and sometimes he was right. It's almost a survivorship bias problem, because all the things that he crashed and burned on People just
Mhm.
don't remember that because that's not sexy and it doesn't work for, making a movie. But how's this one? Everybody talks about how iPhone was such a revolutionary, and it was industry changing, world changing idea. Guess what? According to Adam Grant, it was another engineer within Apple who basically said, look, and Steve's all knowing sort of attitude was, that's going to cannibalize our iPod. So no. So it took insistence and the only technique that seemed to work on Steve, according to,
One of the interesting things about Steve Jobs, though, is like it shows you how arbitrary stuff is. First of all, Jobs would have been nobody without Steve Wozniak, who was the
for
person who
sure,
carried all these great ideas.
somebody I know who wrote a book. It was they had a good saying for it. It was called "Aware, Don't Care." And her basic, I don't know if it's her doctoral thesis, but it's certainly her area of expertise now in her consulting is self-awareness and the value of that in business, right? The oblivious boss pays a very high cost, and that loops very closely back into what I do with, organizational she's an organizational psychologist, but organizational culture, that if the boss is clueless about the effect they have on their employees or how they affect the culture starts at the top, whether we like it or not. And looping back to what I was saying, Adam Grant very clearly stated it was like it was only the insistence of an engineer who knew, as Ed Catmull, who's the guy who did Creativity Inc., as Ed Catmull did, that the way to get around Steve's jump to the conclusion as though I'm all knowing kind of behavior was to say it, let him shoot it down, then come back every week or 2 weeks and say, hey, I've got an idea. Pretty soon, in a few weeks, he's going to steal your damn idea, take credit for it, and say it's a good idea, and it will be the exact same damn idea. So he spent most of his career really stealing the ideas of a lot of the people he worked with.
Let's talk about good bosses for a minute, though. We've spent a lot of time
Yes,
on that.
yes. Yeah,
Um, so I'm thinking, for example, of Ray C. Anderson, the late CEO of a company called Interface, a flooring company.
I love it. I was going to actually mention them and about the environmental stuff they did. So go ahead,
Yeah,
because you
that's where
probably
I'm
met them.
going with this because they're very related. His good bossness and his good stewardship of the earth are totally intertwined. It is, as I said at the beginning of this call, it's a both and. So he became the guy in manufacturing to say first, we have got to take care of the earth. And he had started as a very traditional flooring company in the 1950s and got religion around climate somewhere along the way. And he was known as just a really, really decent human being, a pleasure to work for, and someone who fostered creativity and innovation in his employees, especially when they were directed at lowering the company's carbon footprint, lowering its use of resources, recapturing. I mean, they make flooring tiles out of abandoned nylon fishing nets that they're harvesting from the ocean. Stuff that's going to kill fish if you leave it there. They were, I think, the first company to do modular flooring tiles so that if you are laying your flooring down across an office and there's a 15-inch wide factor that's getting a lot more use because it's the obvious footpath. You can replace those 6 tiles and leave the rest of them alone instead of having to yank the whole floor out. Just brilliant stuff. And a lot of this has continued. He died, I guess, about 10 years ago. And because of the company culture he created, all of that is still very much a part of who they are. Whereas some other companies, they have a great CEO for a while, and then after they leave, things kind of revert slowly.
Mhm. And I think that's what happens. I think there is a natural reversion, especially, and it still starts with the leader, but especially if the leader doesn't set the kind of company vision that Jim Collins talked about.
Mhm.
The idea that if nobody was here to help you make a decision at all levels, this is such a brilliant concept, right? At all levels, it's like, what is our mission? What is our vision? What is the horizon beyond the mountain? Not the mountain we're climbing, the mountain in the distance that we're going to climb next. And that's
Mhm.
higher and beyond that. And what direction, what vision exceeds the life of the person or the individuals who said it, the leaders who said it. And it sounds like that's what Interface carpets.
Yeah, that's what Anderson had done and what the company continues to do. That's what
Right.
Patagonia does. Yvon Chouinard was
Right.
another very similar leader. I have a friend who, until fairly recently, ran a coffee company here in Western Massachusetts, United States, called
Hmm.
Dean's Beans. He actually let his employees take it over from him a couple of years ago, and now he's writing
Hmm.
novels. But every single bean that Dean's company roasted from, I think they were started in 1993 till the present, till now a couple of years after he's out of the picture, is
Hmm.
organic and fairly traded. This was when companies like Starbucks or Green Mountain were saying, "Oh, we're being really sustainable. We have 5% of our stuff coming from sustainable farms." And Dean basically spat on that whole idea and was a gadfly at coffee
Nice.
industry conferences. And interestingly enough, used the significant profits he got as a coffee entrepreneur to go back to the coffee villages where he sourced his coffee and say, "Okay, you folks, I've got this pocket of money available for you to design and carry out a development project that's going to help your village." So
Hmm.
village led, but Dean's Beans funded initiatives on everything from domestic violence to better coffee production.
Hmm. Well, and I like that too because it goes to the circularity you were talking about. Is like if the employees are and the employees, and we're talking about the employees right down to the employees who are supplying the beans, right? The private growers or whatever they are, if they have a good reason, first of all, if you're miserable at home and, if it's, let's use a stereotype here, but if it's the husband working in the field, growing the coffee beans, and because he's so damn poor and he either can't take care of his family or feels hopeless, then he goes home and he beats up his family. You could say that there's an integration. And in fact, I recently listened to one of the ones by Gallup, one of the Gallup or Clifton things, and it was talking about the enormous effect on your life overall of your job. So you can
Mhm.
say, well, you have work-life balance. I agree with that, and I think we should strive for that. But if the place you work is miserable, it casts a shadow on your entire life. So the fact that he's doing that, Dean's Beans or the former leader of it is doing that, it's like, let's go right to the source, all the way to the other end, and thinking about the circularity, it's like interconnectedness is the essence of reality. It isn't
Yeah.
just of, Gaian Mother Earth theory kind of stuff. I know Gaia because I was interested in Greek mythology, but
Mhm.
I also had plenty of friends who were Wiccan. So I was definitely aware of that, especially through those two things. It seems obvious when people start to talk about it and when it's finally starting to be cool to consider these things and the impact it has. And again, if you're proud of what you're doing and it shows a future for you. I saw a TED talk about this recently, and it was not just about, say, for employees taking over the business, but it was about the employees were not just getting paid their wage, but they were getting some portion. It was like a garage door company or something, totally unsexy. But it was like, okay, well, you've been working for us for 20 years or 30 years. Well, now you're a millionaire because of your shares, which were not conditional. They weren't management perks. It was like, as long as you're working here, after a short period of time, we are contributing to each other's future
Mhm.
beyond the paycheck. And it seems so obvious, but most companies is like, we pay you, you lucky to have a job. Well, that's why you've got 100% turnover yearly or more.
Yep. Yeah, and the fair trade, which I mentioned earlier, in case people are not aware, fair trade guarantees a floor price below which the market will not go. And that means that people have enough to live on. And then if you combine that with, like, there's a company called D-Light that I love to talk about. It makes small solar lanterns, LED solar
Hmm.
lanterns, that are replacing kerosene or replacing darkness. Now, kerosene is toxic. Kerosene is
Hmm.
flammable. Kerosene causes thousands of injuries and deaths a year. So you get rid of the toxicity, you're not breathing the fumes. You get rid of the flammability. You also get rid of paying for it every month because you pay, let's say it's a $10 lamp and you're paying $1 a month because that's what you can afford in some very undeveloped part of the world. And then at the end of the 10 months or whatever, you own the lamp free and clear, and now you're pocketing $1 a month that you didn't have before, which maybe you're
Hmm.
making $5 a month. That's huge for you.
And now
And
you have a
so,
light so you can get educated and read, and there's a whole bunch
exactly.
of trickle down.
Yes, a whole bunch of trickle down. So your kids are going to do better in school and therefore get better jobs. And maybe you can start a little cottage industry because now for the first time you can see at night to do
Hmm.
some fine motor work that wouldn't work in the other situation. And on it goes. And it's, we've all heard about the vicious cycle, but there are also virtuous cycles.
Hmm. And we definitely need to focus on them. And it's so easy, right? Like, as human beings, especially in evolution, it was Roy Baumeister did, I think it was an article with one of his co-authors or co-writers that he does stuff with. He did a book called The Power of Bad, and they actually researched from language that people naturally gravitate, and languages in general naturally gravitate towards the negative. That is right from Daniel Kahneman, who talks about loss aversion and that we feel loss about twice as strongly as we do gain of an equal amount. It's natural to do that. And we sort of went down that path. It's like, oh, Steve Jobs is evil. Oh, here, let's actually talk. So it's easy for anybody, regardless of how self-aware, to get off on that path. And this is a perfect time for me to ask you one of the few questions I think are must asks in this interview. And that is, what questions do you think we should be asking ourselves about transforming organizational culture and leadership?
Okay, well, let's start with what are our real goals? And profit is a means to an end. Profit is not an ultimate goal. Okay, money is a tool. So what do you use the money for is how you start to think about your real goal, which should be hopefully something to do with purpose. That's one thing. Whose interest is it in to have me succeed in this venture? How can I partner with those people? I think all of those questions will lead to many more questions, but those are good places to start.
And I love those questions because that's actionable and profitable. And I agree with you that if organizations or leaders or big companies, multinationals, whatever they are, even if they couldn't care less, even if they don't give a shit about the environment, if we can show them that they will succeed in their greed more by being good environmental and corporate citizens, good human citizens, will make them even more money, then we don't have to convince them on the humanitarian and all the
Right.
reasons they should want to anyway.
And I have a shocking example of this. There is a certain retailer out of Bentonville, Arkansas, United States. Probably everyone has heard of. They are
I
the
have.
antithesis of a tree hugger company. They are motivated, I think, very heavily by corporate gain and accumulating
Hmm.
wealth. Their name is Walmart.
Yep.
Walmart has done more for the environment in its requirements of its supply chain, in its operating fleet of trucks, in its stores, than I will ever do if I'm consulting in another 50 years. And I'm 68, so I don't expect to be doing this in 50 years or contemplating much of anything. I doubt very much I'll still be alive in 50 years. But, I do not shop at Walmart because they do a lot of things in terms of their labor policies, in terms of
Hmm.
their store
Hmm.
lighting and their store closing policies that I object to. And also because I
Agree.
prefer to support small retailers, especially those in my own local area. But even if ordering online, I'm going to order from a small retailer typically. I don't order from
Hmm.
Amazon. And Walmart is for purely profit reasons. They have done an incredible job making the supply chain greener, making their own operations greener. And I applaud
Respect.
them. I give them
Hmm.
props. I won't shop there, but I'll give them props for that.
I actually thought you were going to go in a different direction because I knew who you were talking about. I used to work for Walmart. I know some of the shady things that they've done, like, well, as long as we can, in the middle of some towns, if we can be an hour away, we already know that people will drive an hour to go to a Walmart. We're going to drive all the mom and pops out of business and open a store within an hour radius. So I agree. They do some really shitty things, but I'm happy because this is the first time I've ever heard that they're also doing some good things. And again, they're not doing it probably to be nice. They're doing it because it's profitable and it just so happens to be good for the earth. And I think
Yeah,
more,
they've monetized it. They have totally monetized it. I mean, the last time I checked, which was several years ago, Walmart sold more organic food than Whole Foods. And the really interesting
mm,
thing to me is the people who are buying natural foods in Walmart ain't never going to go to Whole Foods. It's a
hmm
completely new market. They doubled the market. They went after a sector that was
hmm
not coming to buy natural foods. And like, yay, okay, good, do that. As you mentioned, store siting is definitely a big issue with them. Labor is a big issue. A lot of people at Walmart are
Hmm.
in government assistance because they can't make it on what Walmart pays them.
Yep.
Whereas Costco, which had a really visionary CEO, Costco was paying
Hmm.
$17 an hour when Walmart and Sam's Club, which Walmart owns, were paying 8. Again, there's a
Hmm.
few, I haven't checked to see what the pay scales are now, but they were making a very nice profit, thank you very much, even by doubling the labor cost that Walmart had.
And I'm glad you mentioned that one because I've got a Costco pretty close to me, but I remember seeing exactly that example where especially some of the stakeholders, especially the more corporate ones, was like, well, da 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 da. And the visionary leader, whose name escapes me,
Jim Senecal.
oh, thank you. I don't know the names of a lot. It's that sort of top down high level. I remember the concepts very well. I don't remember the names worth a damn. That's why I know a lot of authors' names, but not a lot of the people they reference unless it's over and over again.
Well, for authors like me, that's a nice thing.
Yes, yes. I think that's really awesome. And that's exactly what he did. He stood up against those stakeholders who were going like, well, we could be making more. It was like, well, it would seem like that in the small picture, but doing this, we're investing in the asset that actually makes us money. The bottom line is if your employees are unhappy or they're rotating through, like the cost of retraining an employee is depending on who you talk to, which study or which research you look at, it's usually 6 months to a year for an experienced employee. So if somebody leaves, it's going to cost that much just to get somebody else up to speed. And that's probably not an incompetent brand new employee, but a competent employee who just hasn't worked for your organization. And of course, knowledge loss.
Turnover is very expensive in a lot of ways, and people
Yes.
don't realize that. The race to the bottom is expensive because you
Hmm.
leave your customers behind as your levels of service and product quality plummet. Now, it's one thing, I mean, one of the reasons Walmart has been so successful with this is because they came in with a cost-cutting eye. Like, oh, if we can cut the fuel that our trucks are using in half, or the power that we're supplying our stores with in half, and not change the quality of service, then why hell wouldn't we do it? And interestingly enough, Walmart also at the time had a really visionary CEO named Lee Scott. And there's been some backsliding since he left, but it's still basically ahead of most of its competitors in terms of doing good for the environment.
Excellent. And again, like you said, Walmart, props for doing the good thing, regardless of your motivation. Gaia thanks you. We thank you. There are a few questions I want to ask you, and this is a cool one. I'm creating a game for teaching leaders how to transform their organizational culture. This is
Mhm.
just an incipient thing. What question, activity, or game mechanic would be a must have, especially as it relates to your specific area of organizational culture around environmental stuff?
Well, for starters, you have to make it fun, and not all games are. I have played some games that are like, okay, one and done, I'm never playing this again. And what's fun for me is not necessarily the same as what's fun for, say, my son-in-law, who really likes the very cerebral, deep strategy games that I find just frustrating. I can't keep
Hmm.
track of them. So that's one thing. So find out what people will find fun and create something around it. Look holistically. I mean, the butterfly effect is real. If
Hmm.
something that happens on one side of the globe to some small creature will have influence on the other side of the world. We're seeing this now with the fires in Los Angeles raging as we're taping this. Look at unintended consequences and play them out and make sure you're not creating a monster. Nuclear power is a horrible example of technology gone wrong because nobody played out the scenarios of what would really be happening. And do not let anybody try to convince you that nuclear power is a good thing unless they're talking about fusion. And fusion is probably at least 30 years away from realistic and scalable manifestation. So meanwhile, we've
Yeah,
got a crisis to solve. We can't wait around for fusion. We've got to do it with solar and wind and conservation and hydro and all the rest of the
right.
really green alternatives. And by the way, when I say hydro, I'm not talking about damming a huge river and changing the whole ecosystem. There's other ways to do that.
Right. One of my favorites on that stripe, and I'll just mention it briefly, is kite power. That
Mhm.
is using kites to generate energy,
Yeah.
way better than windmills for so many reasons.
Hit it with
And
waves in the hydro side.
yeah, there's
So
there
they're
there's
harnessing
an
the kinetic
underwater
energy.
version of exactly the same thing, and that's the one I think that's best because it's like super energy dense. Imagine flying a tide kite under the water where the density of energy, the tide's coming in anyway, You just fly this kite through the incoming current and you make tremendous amounts of energy, and the kite can be really small because water's like times more dense than air. I'm going to ask you some of the questions I would ask normally at the very end. We can just sort of riff wherever we want to go. Given what we've been talking about, and what could most leaders do to increase the meaning and purpose of their employees' work that's actionable from an environmental standpoint?
I'm going to go back to an example that I generated on the spot when a radio interview asked me, what would you do for a pizza shop owner? And I just spewed this out without really thinking a whole lot about it. But when I thought about it later, I thought, that's really good. I'm going to hang on to that one. So, pizza shop owner, let's say a few blocks away from an urban inner city high school with kids who are not necessarily big achievers in the classroom, maybe a little rough social climate. So, pizza shop owner would go to the school and say, I want to get, like, 5 good kids that want to apprentice themselves and learn not only the skills of pizza making, but maybe the skills of growing the tomatoes and the garlic and the oregano, and maybe the entrepreneurial skills. So they're going to go in and they're going to say on Thursday, hey, tomorrow we're taking orders for fresh homemade pizza that will deliver Monday at lunchtime. They'll get the payments up front, bring it to the pizza shop owner, who then gets all the ingredients to make the pizzas that they know are going to be bought because they're already ordered and paid for, and then sends them into school with the kids. So the kids involved are getting skills in 3 areas: in pizza making, in gardening, and in entrepreneurship. The kids who are eating the pizzas are getting a welcome change from cafeteria food, healthy and natural, nutritious. The kids who are getting those entrepreneurial skills are now much more hireable. They're less likely to join a gang. Their families are also going to become very loyal customers of the pizza shop. Which pizza shop would you choose if you've got 10 of them within walking distance from your house? Are you going to go with the one that's helping your
Mm-hmm.
kids get a real education on top of the book education?
Mm-hmm.
Or are you going to just go to some chain, advertises on TV? So it's this series of interconnected wins. It's again that virtuous cycle I talked about before.
Mm-hmm.
So you have more employable people who were less likely to get into trouble. You have better food, better nutrition going into kids who are eating too much fast food in other parts of their lives. You have a climate, ideally, of cooperation and people working for a greater whole. And because you're doing this on a Monday, if you're in the restaurant business, Mondays and Tuesdays are pretty darn quiet. So you have turned
Mm-hmm.
a dead business day into a prepaid profit center. So, like, nobody loses in this one except the school lunch cafeteria.
Right. Well, and I love that too, because it's also the activity itself is a social good. And as you were talking about this and you were talking about which one would you choose, it reminded me of a book that I'm very fond of, and he's a really nice guy too. Joe Pine's The Experience Economy. The original book was done, I'm looking at the original is 1999. The new edition was in 2019. I've communicated with him a bit. I don't know him except via email, but it was like, well, what's the difference between the books? He says, well, the new one is just an updated version. There's no real significant difference. And I really appreciated that. If it was massively different, I would absolutely support and buy the book. But I also, the fact that he had the integrity to say, well, it's updated, but it's fundamentally the same. So if you've read one, you've more or less read the other.
And I do the same with some of my books that are updates of previous books. I tell people, I say, why are you ordering both of these? You really only need the new one.
Right. And that's a relationship thing, but also it's the experience, not just the bond of the social good, but the relationship, the fact that the person, the pizza practitioner or the author doing that, it's like Dan Heath too, who I've been talking with
Uh-huh.
once every 6 months or a year via email. The fact that he is one of the few authors, because so many of them don't, even I guess you could say loyal fans or whatever. I'm not really a fanboy, but I really respect the fact that somebody like him and Bob Sutton and Joe Pine are in my network, and they might just say one thing every few years, but they actually say it to me and I believe it's them.
Yeah, yeah. Seth Godin answers his own mail. And I really respect that. Bob Berg answers his own mail. And I have corresponded with both of them. And actually, Seth and Bob both have endorsements in this book for my work. And so does Jack Canfield. I've built
Hmm.
personal relationships with people. And that leads me to another point I want to make. We always hear that individual action is worthless and that, until you change big agriculture and big pharma and big manufacturing, you're not going to get anywhere. Well, we do have to make those changes, but we can also change on the individual level. Okay,
Hmm.
here is a glass of water. Water is something we take for granted in way too much of the world. Our descendants, 5 generations from now, they might forgive us for squandering the oil. They might even forgive us for all the pollution we've caused. They will not forgive us for ruining our water supply. And so, like when I brush my teeth,
Hmm.
I turn the water on a trickle, I turn it off, I add the toothpaste. I brush my teeth. I turn it on again to rinse. I'm using teaspoons. When most people brush their teeth, they turn the water on full force. They run it for 3 minutes. They've spent, I don't know, 3, 4 gallons of water sending it down the drain for no reason. That
Hmm.
is the equivalent of pushing gold into the garbage can.
Hmm.
It's clean water is such a special thing that we don't appreciate. So you take that principle, and if you remember one thing from this interview, remember how to brush your teeth, and also then take that into how do you wash a dish? How do you do anything that involves water? Do you water
Hmm.
in the heat of the day when it's half of it's going to be evaporated, or do you water your garden only as needed and only in the late evenings or early mornings when the water is going
Hmm.
to absorb into the ground?
Right.
Again, think holistically.
Right. And I like what you said about the watering. I used to do lawn mowing, but I learned about the horticultural aspect. And yeah, the ideal time is actually early in the morning because then you don't get any sort of overnight rot. If you do it early enough, then you get all the benefits. It absorbs fully, and then anything that would otherwise cause problems with mold is evaporated off as the day goes on. So that's what my research has shown to be the best time. But I love what you said, and it reminds me actually of my mother and my niece, where my niece was doing something outrageously wasteful for water. It could have been doing brushing her teeth, but it was exactly that. It was like she was doing it, and my mom said, that's not really good. Why don't you turn the water off, or why don't you use less? It was like, it's just water. Even James Bond, I don't remember which James Bond it was, but there was one where it was about stealing water or something like that, showing that, even the action hero, it wasn't oil they were stealing, they were stealing water because water is more valuable. We won't die without oil. We are really reliant on it, but nobody needs to drink a gallon or two of oil a day.
Right.
Whatever it is, water is not an option. Oil is, and we certainly need to have better solutions. And I agree mostly. I think the best solution for it is mostly concentrated solar thermal because it's totally doable. We don't need to develop any technology. We just need to scale it. But
Mhm.
yeah, I agree with you about water. Water is something we should never underestimate or take for granted for exactly the reasons you talked about.
So that people can get my monthly newsletter, which is called the Clean and Green Club, and people
Hmm.
can get a series of excerpts from the book by visiting goingbeyondsustainability.com. And
Right.
that there's a ton of resources there. And of course, I am also available for individual consulting. And anybody who says, "Oh, I heard you on Tim's podcast," I will give them a half-hour consult. So
Nice.
that's
Thank you very
that's a hundred
much.
dollar value. So yeah, and that's often enough time to figure out what your company can be doing or your organization can be doing to
Hmm.
address green and social equity stuff in a meaningful way. Obviously, the
Right.
conversation is going to have to continue, but that will get you at least started. And then you can come to me as you need to refine it, or as you want to refine it, or as you need
Right.
marketing.
So, given that, I actually like that. And given that, because all of the social media platforms, sadly, are getting so stingy, I'm going to have to especially point out LinkedIn here. It's like, you're leaving the platform. It's like, no shit. I know I'm leaving the platform.
Yep.
The research actually says that websites and platforms that actually encourage or allow outlinks get actually more ROI because they get so much more backlinks that it's ROI positive to actually allow all the outlinks you damn well please, but they don't do it. So what I'd like you to do here, is there any other, because this way, what I'd like to give them in links in is on platform links. So when this goes to YouTube, I'll give any YouTube links that you have to it. When it's on LinkedIn, I'll give LinkedIn links.
Yeah, I have a YouTube channel which I have not updated in quite a while. I have
Hmm.
LinkedIn. I know you have my LinkedIn, so yeah, you can certainly
Right.
link to that. You can. I hope you will also link to the
Right.
website.
I want you to put this on video and audio so that we can get around that asshole algorithm of stay on our platform. So please tell us the your website address verbally because then it's in the video and then I don't have to put the link in because when you put the link in, their algorithm will punish for off-platform links. So I want to get around that. So
Going beyond sustainability. Goingbeyondsustainability.com.
one word, all lowercase.
One word, case doesn't matter.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you. This kind of gets us all the way there. If you have any sort of closing comments in the last 2 or 3 minutes you have left before your next thing.
Well, I just want to say that what we've touched on is only the very edge of what is possible. That I
Hmm.
did a whole TEDx talk, which you can find on my website, actually, and you can find on
Hmm.
YouTube, called Impossible is a Dare, in which I riffed off a quote by Muhammad Ali, which I misattributed to somebody who was plagiarizing him, I found out later during the actual TEDx talk. But now I correct that as I
Right.
can. I'll read it to you. Impossible is just a big word thrown around by small men who find it easier to live in the world they've been given than to explore the power they have to change it. Impossible is not a fact, it's an opinion. Impossible is not a declaration, it's a dare. Impossible is potential. Impossible is temporary. Impossible is nothing.
Love it. Okay. So let's end it there.
Great. Okay, good to talk.
Bye, Shell.